Thank you very much for coming along to this event with Generation Rent, Renters' Rights London and Priced Out. What we're going to do tonight is try and get a feel for what the various parties who are standing, mayoral candidates and London Assembly candidates in this coming election, have to say about housing, where they can actually deal with the issues. Except George Galloway, for the reasons that have already been explained. And we're very pleased to have the candidates who are with us. So, starting from my left, we have got Tom Copley, who is an Assembly candidate for Labour. We've got Sian Berry, who is the mayoral candidate for the Greens. We've got Zach Polanski, who is an Assembly candidate for the Liberal Democrats. We've got Joy Morrissey, who's an Assembly candidate for Conservatives. And we've got David Curtin, who's an Assembly candidate for UKIP. So we've got the full range here with us tonight. So thank you very much. And what we're going to do is I've got some questions that have been submitted in advance, some questions that have been submitted by people who are here, and we're going to do our best to try and keep things going. But just before we start, let's just get a feel for the room. So how many people here are private renters? Put your hands up. So the absolute majority of people in the room. How many people here are lucky enough to own their own home? Well, that gives a feel for sort of where we are. And how many people here live in social housing? Does that make a difference? So there we are. So we've got a majority of private renters in the room. So that will give you an idea of where some of the questions have been coming from. So just to get us started then, from Alistair Farrow, it's Alistair in the audience. Will the candidates back bringing in rent control? And I'll start with, to my left, the mayoral candidate, Sian Berry.
Hi, thank you for your question. Yes, I could not back this more, basically. I've been, since I was first standing to be the Green candidate for mayor, pushing really, really hard on this. I wrote to all the people standing to be the Labour candidate who were MPs, urging them to put forward amendments to the Housing and Planning Bill, the Cities and Devolution Bill. There are other bills, there are always bills going through Parliament where we could be giving this power to city mayors. What I've said, it's not a power they've given us yet. The mayor, as mayor, I couldn't come straight in and put in rent controls. Things I've said I'd do are keep pushing, work with the other mayors of other cities. We're seeing a lot of devolution to new city mayors for Manchester. We've already got mayors in Bristol and in Liverpool. There's a very, very good case for rent controls in those cities too. And I've said I'll keep campaigning at the government, making the case for it, giving them all the evidence that they need. For example, that businesses are asking for this as well, until it happens. It absolutely has to happen because rent is out of control. I put a new map on my website yesterday, and I may tweet it shortly because my phone is with my assistant who can tweet it for me. We got the latest figures on incomes and rents across each borough, and we're in Camden Borough at the moment. And since we last worked this out during 2014, the percentage of the average take-home pay that is the average rent in Camden is now 73%. And the last time we looked at it, it was 69%. When you look at Barnet, which is the next borough up, it's gone up from 49% to 53%. In just a couple of years, it's out of control. We need caps on rent rises, and I just won't stop until it happens, basically.
Joy, would the Conservatives back that?
Well, speaking on behalf of Zach Goldsmith, he wants to make the London rental standard mandatory and offer 3 to 5 year tenancies and make landlords agree to any rent increases in advance in the contract, so they have to have it agreed upon beforehand in the contract.
But actual rent controls, would he back that?
Well, he actually wants to move toward the long-term build-to-rent model like the German system, where you would have to have a proportion of all new builds offer various levels of rent, so you'd have social rents and different rents depending on where you were on the income, so you'd have truly mixed communities. But that's a very long-term plan of moving us away from buy-to-let and into the sort of German model of build-to-rent.
Zach, what do the Lib Dems have to say on this?
So I'm one of the private renters in Camden, and a third of people in Camden do private rent, so it's something I'm clearly passionate about as the Assembly candidate for Camden, just from also my own personal living circumstances. I think it's important to differentiate. I love Sean's passion for rent caps and rent control, and I would be passionate about them too if they were proven to work. But actually, if you look at somewhere like San Francisco, they call it the Google bus, because actually what's happened where they put strict rent controls in is just pure gentrification. There isn't enough supply, because if you're a landlord, you can start to make more demands about who lives in the house. Those demands get worse and worse and worse, and actually people are just priced out. What the Lib Dems are for, and I'm supporting Caroline Pidgeon, who's our mayoral candidate, is rent tenancies that are capped at the rate of inflation. So we'd make a move towards default of 5-year tenancies. And of course, if a tenant wanted to get out before 5 years, they can do. Because what's really important is that we shift power away from landlords and towards tenants.
David, what about UKIP?
Yeah, UKIP does not support rent caps or rent controls. The reason for that is it might sound like a good idea, but it doesn't work in practice, because what happens if you have rent controls is that there'll just be a freeze on any new properties coming into the market. And at the moment, people do buy-to-lets, which is, people do that, and they set up a house as like a small business where they can get an income from that. So that does increase the availability of houses that are there to rent. If you have rent controls on, it's going to make all those new small businesses that people have in terms of doing buy-to-let inefficient and unviable. So people will just stop doing it, and there'll be less homes available to rent overall. So again, it sounds like a good idea, but where it's been tried in places like Berlin, in places like San Francisco, as Zach mentioned, it doesn't work, and it has the opposite effect of its intention.
Tom, I think you've got something to say on this.
I do. Well, I'm actually moving flats tomorrow, so the issues facing private renters are particularly at the forefront of my mind, particularly with regards to lettings agents. But on the subject of rent control, look, there is no one single form of rent control. I mean, I remember during the last election when Labour proposed to introduce 3-year tenancies with caps on annual rent increases, Grant Shapps came out and called it Venezuelan-style rent controls. Which is utterly ridiculous. You can't mention Berlin and San Francisco in the same breath. They have completely different forms of rent control. Yes, the San Francisco model doesn't work. The Berlin model does work, and it has been successful in holding rents down. And in Berlin, they have indefinite tenancies. The market sets the initial rent, and then increases are capped. And landlords can't evict tenants during that time unless they have a very, very specific reason that is set out by law. And just to say to Joy about Zach, aspiring to move us on to sort of longer tenancies and things like that. Well, you can't hold rents down unless you introduce mandatory longer tenancies, which still give tenants the ability to get out of the contract at 2 months' notice, but mean that the landlord can't jack the rent up in order to try and evict a tenant. And in London, we still, in this country, are governed by private tenancy laws brought in 1989 with only 10% of us rented. Now, more than a quarter of us in London rent, and that's going to be up to a third by 2020. And that includes a lot more families. It used to just be young, single people for a short period of time. You can't have a system of tenancy like this, particularly when so many families are renting for longer, with people living on 6 to 12 months tenancies. You have to bring something in longer as standard. I chair the Housing Committee at City Hall. We published a report called At Home with Renting recently. We looked at, we modelled, we did some academic modelling on what the various different types of rent regulation would mean for the London housing market, and we concluded that what we needed, certainly in the short term, was an increase to 3-year tenancies with caps on annual rent rises, but with an aspiration to increase that further as well. So, I think we need to have a slightly more nuanced debate about this whole system, but the current system is not fit for purpose.
So one thing I'm just going to bring in, and I think we've got a few views here and people who want to join in very quickly, but from Danny Palmer, who's in the audience, who wanted to know, slightly leading off Tom's question, if Berlin can introduce rent controls, why not London? And with that in mind, I'll add to that, whether London is going to end up slipping behind other European capitals if young people and other private renters can't afford to live here. So,
yes, absolutely. London is going to slip behind unless we do something, but I still don't think rent controls are the answer. Tom's right. Berlin and San Francisco are completely different situations, but let's talk about Berlin. Berlin is 90% private rented housing, so already it's a completely different situation. Since they brought in rent caps or rent controls, 186,000 people have left Berlin, which shows an example of what I'm saying about people being priced out and feeling like they can't afford to live there anymore. I think, rent controls is something we should absolutely be looking at, but we need pragmatic solutions here. We don't just need bluster. Something we need to be doing, and the Liberal Democrats should be doing, is building 200,000 new houses. 50,000 of those would be council houses. I think we've got to stop using the term affordable housing. It's a Tory term, sorry, Joy. And I think 80% of housing being affordable is just a ridiculous term in 2016. So we need to be building council housing and a mix of all the other housing too. But this is really a problem of supply, and we need to work on that.
Yeah, I don't agree at all. I wrote, one of the people I wrote to, also an MP, is Zach Goldsmith. I got a very disappointing reply back from him, basically saying, I don't want to interfere in this market. And I think the market is absolutely broken on this. And the idea that if you have caps on, as Thomas described, rent rises, that's not interfering in the market too much. That, in fact, allows your small business person, your person who's building to rent, or your person who's borrowing in order to buy somewhere to rent, that allows them to plan ahead. There's certainty there. There isn't really a problem with putting controls on rent rises. You're not trying to sort of take money out of their pockets tomorrow. You're saying, look, this can't go on rising. And I think this is completely reasonable. And if slightly fewer people were buying to let, there might be slightly lower rises in house prices as well, which might allow some people who are renting and who don't want to be to switch. And there are, I mean, what you say about Germany is 90% of people are in the private rented sector. They've got a very mature rented sector there. Families renting isn't necessarily a problem if they have a secure home. That's what people want. They want a secure home for their lives. And at the moment, we're not letting that happen. The market's completely broken.
Very quickly, and then on to Joy.
Just to say that there's an eviction culture in Berlin that's starting to rise and rise, which is very worrying. So it would be great if families were in stable homes, but the truth is they're just not.
Okay, Joy. Are the Conservatives actually going to be able to do anything without major intervention in the market?
Well, actually, I mean, Zach has committed to this 3 to 5 year tenancies for landlords, that they have to now offer 3 to 5 year tenancies, and making the London rental standard mandatory will require these things to be enforced. So he is taking this seriously. It's in his manifesto. It's not just bluster. He is seeing the need for this and the long-term change that has to occur within London. And London is a very specific demographic. We have different challenges facing this city than any other city in the UK, and they need different solutions. And that's why he is looking at the German model.
David, you're about the only person defending the pure free market here.
Well, I think I'm also responsible for bringing Berlin into the conversation. So let me just explain a bit more about Berlin. Yes, there are controls on the rate of increase, the percentage increase that you can put on rented flats for people who have a long-term tenancy year on year. But if someone leaves a flat and a new person comes in and has a new tenancy, there's no control on that. So when people have a new tenancy agreement, there's no control on the rent. So I would agree in that. When someone makes a new tenancy agreement, you have to negotiate that. But what I would say in UKIP, which is our national policy, along with a lot of the other candidates here, is that we do need some kind of medium hold tenancy of 3 to 5 years to work alongside the short tenancy of 6 to 12 months. And that's something that can only be done through new legislation, through Parliament on a national level, but it's something that UKIP will certainly lobby for. I will certainly lobby for that if I'm on the Assembly, because that's something that will give people more stability in their a longer-term, medium-term rental agreement. So, yeah, well, I would agree.
Tom, what if Sadiq is elected in a month and a half? What can he actually do on this?
Can I just correct something that was said about Berlin? Yes, new tenancies are set by the market, but they can't be more than 10% higher than local market averages. So that's not strictly true. As I think Sian pointed out, unfortunately, private renting is not a devolved issue in London. So the mayor at the moment has no power to introduce rent control or rent regulation or make any tenancy reform, unlike in Scotland, which does, and where in certain cities in Scotland they are. But there are some things that the mayor can do within his existing powers. So one thing Sadiq wants to do is to set up a London-wide not-for-profit lettings agency. And that way, speaking as someone who's just had to fork out several £100s to a lettings agent just so they can change a few names on a standard contract and print it out and get a few keys cut. I think that would be a very good development. He would also, within that, set up a naming and shaming system for the worst landlords so that tenants can be more aware of what they are getting into when they are signing a contract. But can I just say this? Some people have... there's always a danger in this debate. Some people will say, oh, well, rent controls aren't a solution, or at the other end of the extreme, rent controls will be some sort of panacea. It's neither. You have to look at rent regulation as part of a wider reform of housing that involves building a lot more housing, because ultimately supply is the issue. But we can't go on, even if we build a lot more housing, we can't go on with a situation where a third, as it will be soon, of Londoners are renting on 6 to 12-month contracts with all the instability, particularly for children, that gives. And the only way you can create that stability is to have longer tenancies and have caps on the amount that landlords can put up the rents within those tenancies.
So what we're coming up against there is one of the things that's going to come up again and again tonight, which is that the Mayor of London, no matter what they want to do, is ultimately limited by government policy. So quickly, from this end of the table all the way down, would you, if you or your candidate were elected Mayor, lobby the government to give the Mayor total control of London housing policy?
Well, it's the national policy. We've got to go with the national policy as well. But yes, I would lobby for that, yes.
Joy, do you think it should be a mayoral issue?
Well, absolutely, and I think that Zach is in the best position to argue for devolved powers and for the best deal for London from the government, and he's asking for a lot more devolved powers in his manifesto.
I think we need to give the GLA more financial muscle. So one thing that Caroline Pidgeon's proposing is actually a building construction coming out of the GLA. So we would actually have GLA homes that would be not-for-profit, so similar to the letting agent idea, but even from the very beginning. So we'd be building homes as a GLA. That means we'd be able to control those rents, and it would make the market more competitive. So Tom's right, it isn't a devolved issue, but actually there's a lot more the GLA can be doing to make sure they're using that financial muscle. Alongside that, another problem that doesn't often get talked about, I'll be very quick,
This is just a quick one.
there's a lack of skills. So actually, we'd also build a GLA construction academy. So it'd be training people up ready to build those homes.
Would you lobby the government?
I already said I would, really incredibly hard. I mean, I don't want to divert us into all the aspects of housing policy because I'm sure they're all going to come up in this. But I wanted to mention a couple of things we can do to help people help themselves. I'm not quite as enamoured with setting up central construction companies and lettings agencies as some of the other parties. I think we need to be letting renters campaign for these things themselves. There are 2.3 million people in rented homes in London. So what I've said I will do is fund some of the amazing groups like Generation Rent or Renters' Rights London. There are many local groups as well. Help them to come together and set up a renters' union to help them to stand up for themselves. And to assist with that, I'd commission work to set what a living rent for London would be. And that's really important as well, because you can bandy around the 30%, 35% of your income is affordable. But I'm not sure it is. I think there are other things about the quality of life in London that mean it's actually more expensive to live in London, and potentially we might need a figure that's even less. And once that figure is set, that gives people a target to campaign for, and I think that could be really important as well.
And Tom, if Sadiq is elected mayor and we've still got a Conservative government, how will he be able to lobby for more power for City Hall?
Well, I think that Sadiq will be in a very strong position. He can go to the government and say, look, I have the biggest directly elected mandate in Europe after the President of France. And I've been elected on a manifesto which says that I want to have powers over the private rented sector in London. We have a government that is, on paper at least, committed to devolution. I think that Sadiq will be in a strong position, backed by a strong mandate from Londoners, to get the powers over the private rented sector that he wants. And look, let's not kid ourselves that a Conservative government is going to be any more likely to give Zach Goldsmith powers over the private rented sector than it would be to Sadiq Khan. Oh, and just to say as well, in response to Zach talked about GLA homes, Sadiq will set up homes for Londoners, which will also get City Hall building homes directly.
It's good to know that everyone will be building lots of homes as soon as this election's over. Now, is Nicole Holgate in the audience? It's Nicole. So Nicole has sent a question, and she's a tenant of Butterfields, is that correct? Which is up in Walthamstow. And while I'm loath to read out a story on your behalf, I think given I've currently got the mic, it might be easier. That was housing that was sold by a charity, which is now the new landlord is choosing to push up the rents and drive people out and sell it off. I believe, is that a correct summary?
They're not bothering to push up rents, they are evicting tenants.
They're going straight to eviction. So with that in mind, the question is, what will each candidate do to prevent unfair evictions from property? I'm going to start with David.
Again, it comes back to the length of tenancy that you do have. If you come to the end of a tenancy, then there's nothing to say that a landlord shouldn't seek to get the house back at the end of the tenancy. But if we have longer tenancies and medium-term tenancies, and that gives people greater security. So again, it comes back to what we said before of having medium hold tenancies of 3 to 5 years, which will give a lot more security.
So what would you actually do if eviction is considered unfair by a tenant? Would you provide a new way of them challenging that eviction?
Well, if you come to the end of a tenancy agreement, then you have to come up with a new tenancy agreement. So there isn't any, you can go through a Section 21 eviction, which means that the landlord has to, get an eviction notice from the court and give you 2 months' notice to leave. But at the end of the tenancy, it's you have to negotiate a new agreement. So with the longer tenancies, I think that would help. But most landlords are good. 90% of landlords are good. There are cases where there are evictions, obviously, but with the longer tenancies, we think that would be, give a bit more protection to people who are tenants.
I'm going to jump to Sian there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty grim case, actually, and it just really highlights the fact that renters need more rights in general. I mean, I hope that by having a renters' union, having the ability of people to band together to offer each other legal support and their own experience of how they have fought things like this, we might be able to do better than we are doing. And I think there's a strong campaign behind your case now, but it is really, really difficult in the current situation with the law if they're doing everything by the book, which they may not be, and I think that's the thing that we need to be looking into. If they're doing everything by the book, it can be very, very difficult for tenants to exert their rights. And we see the same thing as this on a lot of the council estates at the moment that are being regenerated by councils of all kinds, actually. I mean, I was down at an estate in Kensington and Chelsea, which is a Tory council, and there's many, many Labour councils taking part in this as well. And absolutely every time, the private tenants who are renting from people are renting former right to buy homes, are absolutely nowhere in that process because they have no rights at all. So the council tenants will have some consideration to be rehomed. The leaseholders get really rubbish compensation. They're really hard done by, but at least they get some compensation. Private tenants are just thrown out on the streets, and I think it's really, really tough for people at the moment who privately rent in London. There is no security, and there are people all over London just at the end of a tenancy told to go. No reason given, and they're moving and moving and moving, and they can't settle down, and that's just wrong.
Joy, how would Zach protect people when they come to the end of a tenancy or find that the landlord has chosen to sell the property when they don't want to move out?
Well, in the case of Butterfields, I think this is a really horrible case, and I've looked into it because Glasspool is a charity that sold without consulting you. Is that correct? They didn't offer for you to buy your flats. They didn't try to sell it to a housing association. They actually tried to sell. They sold it directly to a private developer, and that really is deplorable because it's left you in a very vulnerable position. I was looking through cases. Even your MP said, this is a charity that really isn't acting like a charity. The only case that I saw was the case in Hackney where a similar thing happened, and the Mayor of London did intervene, and he was able to broker a deal with the private developer to get a housing association to buy the properties. And I think you should get a commitment both from the Labour representative, and I will take this forward on behalf of Zach to lobby him if he's elected, that you need to get a deal, you need to pressure this private developer to sell to a housing association to protect your rents so that it would go into a housing association tenancy to protect the social rent levels that you're having and to give you more security. And I think it absolutely is deplorable the way that this charity has treated you, and I think that that's the best way forward. I actually spoke to the deputy mayor of London about this, and he didn't know about the case, and I think you're doing a great job building the publicity, but I would say even build it even higher, because to pressure this private landlord to shame him and hopefully get a housing association who will buy him out, and then you could have those secure tenancies again. That would be, for your case, the specific solution that I
So shaming them is more powerful than changing the law in
well,
this
and Zach's plan is to change the law, and he wants to actually make the London rental standard mandatory and also offer 3 to 5 years tenancies, that you cannot raise the rents or change the tenancy during the contract. So that would be a huge step forward that Zach is committed to. But in the meantime, that would be what I would recommend for right now.
So Zach, I mean, sort of protecting people at the end of a tenancy, like in this case, would that be basically another version of rent controls which we've dismissed previously?
No, not at all. I agree with everything that's been said, actually, and it's clearly an outrageous case. The end of tenancies is what contributes for most to homelessness, and actually particularly in issues like LGBT youths or women suffering from domestic abuse. You only need to walk on the streets tonight to see on a night like this the amount of homeless people on the streets and how horrendous that is. So something clearly needs to change here. Just to go back to something that Tom said before, I'm in a slightly difficult position because I know Tom's a really good guy, and actually he's been on the Assembly fighting the good fight for housing. Zach Goldsmith, I think, clearly isn't right for London. We've seen what Boris Johnson and the Conservatives have done to housing over the last mayoralty. But I'm not convinced Sadiq's the right guy either. He's in the pockets of property developers. He was getting double the donations from property developers that he was from trade unions. And if you go on the website on his manifesto, he says that he's going to make sure that half of the homes he builds are affordable, which if you flip it over means half the homes he builds won't be affordable. How is that a Labour mayor? So I'm not convinced Sadiq is right for this city.
Is Caroline committing to 100% affordable housing on developments?
Caroline's committed to 200,000 new homes, 50,000 of those will be council.
This is an important point, because actually I take issue with having a go at Sadiq for bringing back the 50% affordable housing target, which was brought in under Ken Livingstone and then abolished under Boris Johnson. I think it's a little bit disingenuous to attack Sadiq for that, unless you're prepared to say what your candidate offers as an alternative in percentage terms. I think it is disingenuous to attack Sadiq for that. I think the 50% affordable target is incredibly important. It's particularly important because it gives boroughs, when negotiating with developers, an extra weapon, despite the fact that the government at the moment are doing their very best to take away most of the weapons that local authorities have to deal with developers when negotiating on planning decisions.
Tom, why is your candidate taking so much money from property developers who are not known for their natural generosity to Labour candidates?
Well, look, I mean, Sadiq, Labour politicians, on the one hand, you take money from property developers, you get attacked for that, and then you take money from trade unions, and then you get attacked for that as well. I haven't seen who Caroline has accepted donations from. I think if you look at Sadiq's manifesto, you'll see there are many things in there that property developers do not like. Most of them do not like the fact that he's proposing a 50% affordable housing target. Many of them might not even like the fact that he wants to get in and get City Hall commissioning homes directly on the mayor's land. So rather than just looking at him and attacking him on that front, I think look at what he is offering in his manifesto and judge him on that.
Yeah, I mean, he has been taking money from property developers and landlords, actually. I worked out that the amount he's received from landlords, which is about £93,000, is about how much I've given to my landlord in the past 10 years. So I'm kind of the opposite. I'm giving money to landlords. Well, possibly, actually. But I've got quite a big landlord. My landlord owns my whole street. But yes, I mean, I think just saying this is my new target when we know that what we're getting at the moment is about 25% affordable housing out of developers. I think they'd be incredibly relaxed about this target coming back because they've spent the last 16 years or 10 years, however long it is since Ken Livingstone brought in the higher target, perfecting ways of getting out of it. And we've actually got to change the model that we're using. We can't just say, I'm going to try and get more out of the big developers. We have to be doing more to create a different ecology, a different set of people doing the development. And I want to bring in the land, the idea of setting a housing company and building on the land that we have. We do have a lot of public land, I think is right, but I think that housing company shouldn't just be building, shouldn't be doing big deals with big developers like TfL have already started to do. We need to be doing lots of smaller deals with lots of smaller developers, developers who are maybe self-builders, who are cooperatives of people who've got together who want to build. Those people want to live in those homes. They'll build them more quickly. They might not be profit-making models, but they'll pay something for the land. And I think this is the way forwards. We need to be building the secondary market that isn't just the free market and isn't just council homes, although they're really important as well. And we will be raising more money to put into grants for real social housing as well. But I think this other market where there are all these people like me who could get enough money together for the bricks and mortar, but the land values are so ridiculous in London that we can't afford that. And that putting the public land towards that model, I think could create something really, really amazing in London and really change things.
Supporting smaller developers is also in Sadiq's manifesto, so thanks for the reminder.
A rare bout of agreement is breaking out. Now, Sarah Fox, who kindly listened to me and agreed to ask a question, was one saying, what are the thoughts of the candidates on introducing longer-term tenancies? And if they are in support of them, I'm going to ask them what concrete measures they take to actually implement such a move. And I will start, because I've been finishing them with Tom.
I think we've covered this. At the moment, the mayor doesn't have the power, so the one thing that you need to do straight away is go to the government and lobby for these powers to be devolved. They have been devolved in Scotland. They should be devolved in London. And based on the research that we did at City Hall, my view is that we need to be going for 3-year tenancies with caps on annual rent rises in the first instance, and then moving towards 5-year tenancies, which is the model contract suggested by Shelter. That's my position, but you have to start by getting the powers off the government in the first place.
I mean, that is true about existing homes. I think there is stuff you can do with the London Plan, which is the planning rules for London and what governs new buildings in London, and also what you do on the land that you own. If you've got the freehold on a land and you sell it to a developer who's going to develop it and hold the lease on, you can set terms there of the leases that they can use. So I think there is stuff we can do with the new builds that we have. But you know, if we're all going to build 200,000 homes by 2020, and there are something like 3.5 million homes in London already, we're not going to make a huge impact on the market there. We do need the powers to do the job throughout the market.
I'm sorry to be boring, but I agree with Tom and Sean. I've lived in Camden for 10 years, and I've moved house 6 times. I'm a young person, and I can handle that. But if you're a family, or if you're in a different kind of living situation, that is absolutely devastating. So I think longer-term tenancies is something that we all need to absolutely be pushing for. To pick up on something Sean said before, she was talking about the amount of public land available. If you put all the land that TfL owns and isn't using together, you'd have land the size of Camden. So when UKIP tells us that London is full, it's really not true.
And how would you actually implement these longer-term tenancies, the Lib Dems?
Well, lobbying the government.
I agree. Joy, could you lobby the government on this one?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and it's in Zach's manifesto. He wants to extend these tenancies to 3 to 5 years, but he also wants to move toward the build-to-rent model and guarantee and amend the London plan so that a proportion of all new homes built are set aside for rent. He also wants to follow the example of Greater Manchester, where local authorities partner with private investment to create large-scale private rented homes at discounted rates on public sector land. He wants to build in the small developments, as you said, on TfL land, but he also wants to go after the big developers and any of the backroom deals that are happening. He wants to create a land levy, which would open up private land that's being hoarded by developers.
Right, so there's a lot of wants there. Let's get back to the precise one of the terms of having a longer contract. What would the one thing he'd do as an actual policy to make that happen?
He's going to make the London rental standard mandatory, and in his manifesto he says he's going to extend tenancies for 3 to 5 years, and that at the start of those tenancies you're not allowed to raise rent unless it's agreed upon in advance, written in the contract. So you can't have these huge rent increases that would happen overnight. They would have to be agreed upon in advance in the contract.
Many
to give
Londoners,
at least the 5-year security for the tenant.
A great many Londoners aren't in a position to reject a
Well,
contract if a
I think
landlord
that
decides
he
to
is
say, I'll
in
put
the
it
best
10%
position
each year,
to
take it or leave
negotiate
it.
a devolved power for London. He is of the same party. He has already advocated for many powers that the government has seen his side of it. He is in the best position. Sadiq has no track record of working cross-party. He has nothing to show that he can work with the government.
If the Conservative position is that a Conservative government will refuse to work with a Labour mayor, I think that's astonishing.
Well, they're not
and I
saying
think
that,
that's,
but where has there
okay, they're
ever
not
been
saying that.
anything
Fine,
that
so they
Sadiq
will
has
work with a Labour
offered to
mayor.
work
I'm glad we did.
cross-party
And if you
with
look
the
at how a
Conservatives.
Conservative government has worked with Richard
Even
Leese
the
and
Chancellor, the Shadow Chancellor works with Zach on Heathrow. I have never seen anything. And if you look at Sadiq Khan's record within his constituency, his majority has decreased. He only won by 3,000. Zach's majority increased by 20,000, the most of any MP in Parliament. So he is doing the right thing and working hard for his residents.
Let's
I
hear Tom's come back on this.
remember in 2010 when the Conservatives were expecting to win Tooting. And I remember the look on Mark Clark's face, because it was Mark Clark, of course, who stood in that constituency against Sadiq. Bottom lip trembling because they didn't win. That is because Sadiq Khan has worked tooth and nail to hold that constituency. But that's not the point here. The point is, if you look at what we're talking about his ability to influence a Conservative government. If you look at how the Conservative government has worked, say, with Greater Manchester, a Labour authority, I think they are willing actually to do deals with Labour mayors. So I think it's disingenuous and I think just a pre-election tactic to suggest otherwise. And actually, if a Conservative government wasn't willing to work with a Labour mayor, I think that would be an astonishing admission.
So sitting above the fray, I better go along to David and ask him his views on what we were originally talking about, which is how on earth we'll have a 3 or 4 year
It's all right, it's all happening around me, yeah. I mean, we've answered that question a little bit before, and I think we've all talked about having longer tenancies. And it was our national policy in the general election manifesto last year that we would push for having 3 to 5 year tenancies. And if Peter were the London mayor, we'd obviously lobby for that to happen, but that we need an act of parliament. Which we would lobby for perhaps over England and Wales. So it wouldn't just benefit London, it would benefit the whole of England and Wales. But what we would say as well is that a lot of people who are losing out at the moment are all the people who are tenants in social housing in the 3,500 council estates around London. And what we're finding in many, many of them is that they're being regenerated and often working with Labour councils like in Southwark, like in Ealing, who are doing deals with big property developers. And they're promising that the people who live there, who are council tenants, will have the right of return. But you find in many, many of these estates, the developers and the councils are finding ways to weasel out of that. And the people, they've been sent away for a couple of years while the estates are redeveloped, and then they find they can't move back in, and then they find that they've lost their tenancy, and they're having to pay an awful lot more in rent than they had. What we would say as UKIP is that for any of these large developments that take place, including on council estates, the 3,500 council estates across London, we would give the local people the opportunity to call binding referenda and the right of veto on any developments that happen, so that the local people will have an absolute control over what happens in the estates that they live in, so that they won't find themselves pushed out and their rates go up. And that's something I think UKIP will do as a very, very concrete measure to protect the people who are living in council estates.
Thank you. I'm just going to quickly do a very quick fire one along from Tom all the way down. Should people who currently live in London have priority on housing rather than people who've moved here in the last couple of years?
Well, Sadiq said that on land that is owned by the mayor, the homes that are built there the Londoners will have priority first. And I think it's 3 or 5 years, but I'm just going to have to check what the residency requirement is.
Sean.
This is really important actually, because we are seeing there's a kind of voluntary agreement that Boris has where they're supposed to market things first in the UK, but you're seeing absolutely ridiculous amounts of advertising going on for the developments that are being done here in the Far East, in all these like emerging markets where people are looking for investments to buy, and that's really, really wrong. Someone I know was I went down to sort of Hammersmith area the other day, and someone there was looking at a new development and thinking, I can't afford my rent very much. I've got a deposit now. They've had an inheritance or something like that. I want to buy somewhere, so they put in an inquiry, and they were told, we're not sure yet what we can do for you because we have to wait to see what comes back from Hong Kong next week. I mean, that's absolutely outrageous when you've got Londoners there. So yeah, we do need a much stronger enforceable agreement on this, and it is difficult when it comes to residency, and I'm quite uncomfortable with that. But I think people who are already in London, it needs to be marketed here and not abroad. I think that's where the marketing takes place, rather than the nationality of the person who's buying more than anything.
So should it be London homes for London workers?
Well, Sean picked up on the dual side of the argument there. So if we're talking about buying homes, then absolutely that should be for Londoners. It should be advertised in London, it should be sold in London, and we should stop foreign investors coming over and skimming property. How could you actually stop
foreign investors buying those properties?
Well, again, it's not a devolved thing, but it's something that we should be lobbying the government on and really making sure that the GLA are taking a stand on it. When it comes to social housing, in terms of non-Londoners taking social housing, and I think this is what Sean was alluding to, I'm much more uncomfortable there with saying that should be for Londoners. If we look at the refugees coming over, for instance, the idea that someone clings to the back of a lorry and then we should not give them housing seems disgusting to me. So I think that's a lot more complicated. But if we're talking about buying houses, Londoners first.
Yeah. Joy.
For buying houses, Zach would like a 3-year, someone who's lived or worked in London for 3 years to be able to be entitled to either the sort of discounted first-time buyers or those on average salaries. He would like all properties built on TfL land to be first offered to first-time buyers who have lived and worked in London for the past 3 years. He wants to amend the London plan to guarantee more homes are set aside for Londoners on average salaries so that who are being priced out currently of the London market. So he does want to set aside and develop policies for those who are working in London, who are on average salaries, who are priced out of the market, but also don't qualify for social housing. So that's a very specific niche of housing that he would like to sort of build policies
So under Zach's
around.
policy, if I was pushed out of London, I think that's a fair
It
question.
was 27,000, I believe, was the average. And then the low, and average and also low
Okay, if we
income.
just let Joy have a response.
Anything near it. So as an average, it only applies to the top 50% of people in work. Most people in work do not earn anything near £27,000. Until you start understanding that, you will not come out with a range of policies that benefit most people.
Well, I
let's
should
hear your
clarify. So it's low income as well, and
Can we just hear Joy's response?
you know, the thing is that there is a need for people who are working, like myself. I have a child. I cannot ever afford to get on the housing ladder. And unless I am homeless on the street with my child, I can't even get a housing association property. So this is an issue that has personal relevance to me. I understand how difficult it is in London to make ends meet. And I am because I believe that he is the person who can give us the policies and stand up to developers who right now we're just getting a polarization where we're getting homes built for the very, very rich, and then we have some social housing, but we don't have houses being built for people who are working hard in London but can't afford to get on the housing ladder. And that is where we need to fill the gap in the market. That is where we need to find creative solutions. I'm sorry?
If we could just keep that, we've already dealt with that one, I think. We've already had 2 questions on that. I'll move on and ask David now.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of restricting houses for foreign owners, it is a big problem. I mean, we've all said. Often the new developments are marketed in Dubai and Russia, Hong Kong, for example, before people in London even know what's going on. I like the Danish model where if you want to buy a house in the country, you have to have been a resident for at least 5 years. And I would certainly be in favour of restricting people who are domiciled abroad from buying homes in London. So that would be something that could restrict people who aren't living in the country from buying the homes and make them more available for Londoners.
Right. Well, is it Rex Davis? I think. Well, hi there, Rex. There's a question about guardianship, which is, I believe, when you are occupying a property which is waiting for redevelopment or something similar. In fact, there's a microphone, so why don't you quickly explain the question?
I'm not sure if you're aware what property guardianship is, but it's where you occupy a vacant property to protect it from squatters, which is more necessary for business buildings at the moment. So I live in an office, and I've been doing this for about 7 years almost now. And the agencies that get us in aren't regulated. And for 10 years now, there's been no regulation. And I've got a Facebook group that's the only support group in the UK for people. They come to me all the time saying, you know, these guys are basically trying to kick me out with 24 hours notice. Shelter can't help me, they're not giving me any advice. Would you guys support bringing in some form of regulation for these agencies?
And just before we hand back the mic, Rex, is it substantially cheaper? Is it the only way you can afford to live in some of the areas that you are staying in?
In any area, yeah. It's substantially cheaper, but the prices have been going up. And the agencies have been engaging in price fixing to force them up to almost market rates in some cases, especially for council flats, which is quite despicable, really.
Brilliant. Tom?
I think there was a programme on Channel 4, a sort of comedy programme, wasn't there, which painted a rather rosier picture of property guardianship than his actual case. I've heard horror stories from people who have been in this situation. And these generally aren't people that are making a sort of active, proactive choice to do this. These are people who it's their only option. And they are living in places that are leaking, with mould on the walls, with rats running around the place. They can be kicked out, as you've heard, at such short notice. We need to be moving away from this precarious housing situation. But there's another reason as well. You know what? I want to see empty buildings brought back into use. I want them to be brought back into community use. And there's a couple of people here from a fantastic project in Dalston called The Hive. I suggest you look it up, go there, visit. An empty building owned by a private landlord. They've come to an agreement with him where they can use the building, turning it into a community hub. They have performances there. All sorts of things are going on. And it's turned a building which is dead, basically, which is essentially a blight on the street, and made it something vibrant for the community. That's the kind of way, that's the kind of things that landlords should be doing in order to, if they want to protect their building or they want to, secure it or whatever, make it into something useful for the community. And not just private landlords either. The public sector is bad at this. I want to see old fire stations and old police stations and old schools brought into temporary use for the community, rather than being used to exploit people at the bottom of the property ladder.
Brilliant. Zach,
even better.
Would be better.
So I also have personal experience of this. Just before I go on to that, just to answer the lady in green as well, or to add on to it, if you took the average rent that someone's earning in London and took the average mortgage, it would take them 95 years to save for a deposit. So that's just to further that. 10 years ago, I was a young actor, moved to London. I couldn't afford rent, so the nice thing about having a microphone these days is I can name and shame. So I met Camelot, although there are different guardianship companies out there. And I found an empty property in Paddington. It was the only place I could live. It clearly was substandard, but I was desperate. They wanted £1,000 up front. So it was a month's deposit. It was a fire and emergency kit, because apparently you could live there without a fire and emergency kit. And it was various admin fees and that kind of thing. So I saved and saved and saved and borrowed some money from friends, and I had my £1,000, and I waited to meet the agent at the spot that I was waiting, that the handover was going to happen. After half an hour, he wasn't there, so I texted the Camelot company and said, "Hey, I'm still here, are you coming?" And they said, yeah, we're on our way. An hour later, still no one came. And just in my head, I thought, I've got £1,000 to give you, and you're an hour late. What's this going to be like when my shower's broken or when the heating isn't working? These guardianship companies have come about because of an absolute lack of the Labour government for 13 years to build housing, so we've got a complete lack of housing. The Lib Dems in government did get 70,000 empty homes into use, but I'd agree with Tom, we need to be doing more with empty homes. We need to be looking at more community projects to be getting those things in. But I think the guardianship schemes, the fact that the government could promote them as a way of dealing with the fact that we've not got affordable housing is quite disgusting. It really clearly isn't a way forward.
David, what do you think about this?
I mean, the whole debate we're having about housing and about house prices, we're missing one really big issue. And we're all talking about increasing supply, to try and make there be more houses for everyone to live in. But what we also need to do is look at the demand side of the equation as well. And it is a fact that the population of London has gone up from 7.3 million in 2001 to 8.7 million today. And there's another 100,000 people living in the capital and coming to the capital every year. And that is due to immigration. And you can't get away from this fact. And you have to put the two things together. We all want to make there be enough houses for everyone in London to live in, so that everyone can live in a decent house at a decent rent. But while there's a massive population increase of 100,000 a year, and we're only building 20,000 homes a year, the problem is just going to continue getting worse and worse year on year. And
Let David have the microphone, please.
And I mean, I just have to be honest about this, because the parties were talking about, bringing schools into housing, converting a few fire stations, converting a few police stations. Some candidates promised, I'm going to build 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 homes a year. And the same promises have been made every election for the last 16 years since the mayor's office and the assembly's office was created, and there hasn't been any change. I mean, UKIP does look at this holistically. We look at it along with our national policy. We have to say that we need to restrict immigration by having an Australian-style point system, which will at least stop there being the huge population increase, because we're never going to be building these 40, 50, 60,000 homes a year. However many candidates promise it, however many times they promise it, it simply isn't going to happen, because on May the 6th, the election's over and it isn't going to happen. And so we do need to...
Sorry, can we actually just leave it to the... No, can we leave it to the people on stage?
We do need to reduce... Can I just finish?
Sorry, can we actually listen to the people who are on the stage?
I'm not blaming it on immigrants. No, I'm not blaming immigrants at all.
Excuse me, madam. Sorry, can we listen to the people who are on the stage?
Talk about the 3 million more people over 75 who are now living because of longer life expectancy. Talk about the changing demographics of people living...
Sorry, we're going to move on.
We have a greater stress and demand on housing.
Well, I would disagree, because it is almost all due to immigration and the effects of immigration, and we do have to be honest about that. A vote for UKIP is a vote to say you agree that you need a mayor that's going to lobby to have an Australian-style point system to cut immigration. We're not against immigration totally. Some immigration is good, but the level that we have into London, with that, we're never ever going to solve the housing crisis. And you've got to be honest about that to make that happen.
Well, apparently this question was about whether you can regulate guardianship, so we'll see how we do on that. If we can try and tie it back a tiny little bit, I'm going to trust in our Green candidate for mayor to do just that.
Okay, I just want to be a little bit honest about David for a second, and how outrageous what he just said was. If you go to any hustings, you'll hear the UKIP candidate saying that. London needs to grow. London is a welcoming place. Our population grows. If you put up a barrier against Europe and the rest of the world, are you going to put one up against Wales next, or the north of England? Because we welcome people into London, and our population will grow no matter what we do. And I just think what you said was outrageous. So, moving on to property guardians, it is a real worry. This is supposed to be a temporary thing for people, just to help out the owners of the property while it was left empty for a while. It's turned into a little mini industry of substandard tenancies. It's like the 0 hours contracts of living in a home at the moment. And something has to be done to regulate this, because people are living in basically dangerous conditions. They're being exploited for rents that are very nearly the market rate now. That's really catching up with it. And I've even seen housing associations kind of do this. They want to sell a property, so they'll have tenants who have good, long-term contracts, and then as they come to an end, or people die and things like that, they put guardians in, and they charge guardians an absolute fortune to live in properties they're no longer repairing, because they're basically waiting for the last tenant to go, and then they're going to sell it off, and I think it's just basically exploitation. And I think we do need to be looking at this. If I'm not elected mayor, I will be elected, one hopes, to the London Assembly, and from there we can look very closely at this and try and work out things we can do, because I think it's starting to turn into something really dodgy. There are temporary things, though, I think we do need. The Mothership was another example of something similar to the Hive, where in Camden we closed a housing office, and people tried to move in and start a social centre and live on 5 floors of amazing space that was going to be left for at least another year while planning permission was gone through and things were prepared for replacing it with another building. And I think there are loads of spaces like that. And meanwhile, you've got all the homeless charities who are great at getting off the people off the streets who are rough sleeping and looking after them in hostels for a few months. But then when they need to move on, the private rented sector is such that they end up being moved out into the private rented sector and then sort of running into trouble with rents or deposits and boomeranging straight back onto the streets again. We need good, temporary, quality spaces, and we could be providing that in lots of our public buildings and lots of things that are being redeveloped but haven't been yet, in the current way that property guardians do, but in a much, much higher quality way.
Joy, isn't standing up for the rights of private companies who have property and want people to live in them temporarily, isn't that a Conservative measure, a traditional Conservative stance?
Well, it's a very popular measure in my Labour-run council in Ealing, and I've met with a lot of these property guardians who are actually living in Acton Town Hall. That's one of the places where they are. One was a Green council candidate, actually. And I think they should be treated as full-fledged employees. You're doing a service. It's outrageous that they're charging exorbitant fees for something that you're providing. You're providing a security service. You should be, at the very least, protected under law as an employee who is providing security. You're doing something. You should have at least that. They should not be allowed to evict you. You would never be able to just fire someone from a job like that. I mean, there needs to be a change in the cultural mindset of what you're doing. You are doing a service that deserves a level of compensation at the very least. And I think, I know it is very popular, and a lot of councils use it as well, because it actually does deter from break-ins and crimes, and it does help the area actually be safer. But you're providing a vital service, so you need to have a level of compensation for that. And I think that this whole market being unregulated, it hasn't been examined fully. So,
thank you. Now, tonight we've been trying to focus on private renters and the issues affecting London renters, but one of the issues that quite a few people have asked about at the same time is the housing bill. And Andy and Susan in the audience are among those who've raised it. So if you'll please, and please do listen to the answers and respect the time of the candidates who've come along here today to talk about it. If they wanted to very briefly give their views on the housing bill that's currently working its way through Parliament, then we will happily hear them, and starting again with Tom over there.
The Housing and Planning Bill is the worst piece of housing legislation in living memory. And it is an ideological assault on social housing, because the now recently, thankfully departed housing advisor to David Cameron, a guy called Alex Morton, is on record as saying that social housing causes social problems. Now, thankfully, he recently departed Downing Street, so you never know, there may be a few small improvements to the bill as it goes through the parliamentary process, and indeed the House of Lords are very unhappy with the bill, and they are taking their time on it as well. But it's a bill that attacks social housing. It is a bill that plays a zero-sum game, taking money away from social housing and affordable rent and putting all the eggs into one basket, which are these starter homes, which are being defined as affordable, and they cost in London up to £450,000. Meanwhile, the government that preaches localism is imposing on boroughs how many they should have and preventing boroughs from arguing for more traditional forms of affordable housing instead. So that's localism, and £450,000 is affordable. This is the kind of abuse of language that Orwell would have recognised. And it is also a bill which treats London as a cash cow, because where is the money for the forced sale of council housing? Where's most of that going to come from? Most of it's going to come from London boroughs. And not only that, most of it's going to come from inner London boroughs, where the need for genuinely affordable council housing is the greatest. And what will this money pay for? It will pay for starter homes in other parts of the country. That is the reality of the Housing and Planning Bill. It is a terrible piece of legislation. We may see a few small improvements to it through the parliamentary process, but we should be absolutely clear that it will still be a terrible act when it is passed into law.
Joy, it's a Conservative policy. Do you think it's one that you completely defend?
I didn't really come here tonight to even mention the bill, because I'm here to speak about... Well, I mean, because...
No, that's a fair point. We did invite people here.
Because it's about London, and I'm here for Zach, because he is the candidate. I'm not here speaking... No, that is a national policy. I am here to defend Zach for the devolved powers for
voted
the
for
mayor. I mean,
So do you defend the housing bill as it currently stands? That's a simple question.
I think there are many things that could be looked at. The one thing that I think is good is the cutting down for rogue landlords. There are measures in place in the housing bill that will tackle rogue landlords, making it easier for people to complain, to actually fine them and to blacklist them. There is that is in the housing bill that is a positive step forward.
But
I'll leave it at that.
a mixed bag, it's fair to say, in that case, then.
I'll leave it at that.
Over to David.
Okay, well, in the general election last year, I stood in Camberwell and Peckham, which is in the borough of Southwark, and there are huge numbers of council tenants there just living their lives happily, and through no fault of their own, they live in estates which are now in central London, and every inch of the land that they live on is really brown gold, if you like. It is land which is immensely valuable to property developers who want to come in and push them off, it would seem, and put up huge high-rise buildings all over central London to make an awful lot of money and sell them to people who are wealthy from overseas. And I think the housing bill is going to enable that to happen. And what we in UKIP want to do is defend the right of people who live in London to stay in London, and we really are completely against this destruction and dissolution of the communities which already exist in London. And so we're completely against that, and we want to make sure that people who live in London in social housing estates have the right to call referenda which are binding to stop their estates being sold off, and if they are to be regenerated, that they will have an absolute say in what's going to happen to their estates. So we will be completely against any effect of the housing bill which is going to destroy existing communities.
Zach.
UKIP love referendum, who knew?
Democracy.
Indeed. Our political system is so well and truly broken, and this country is in a lot of trouble. It's come out since the coalition that actually the Tories said to one of the Lib Dem ministers, don't put more social housing there, you're just growing Labour voters. A third of MPs are landlords. This is like asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. It's so corrupt. This bill is a nightmare, and we need to kill it.
It is. It's absolutely ideological. I do agree with almost everyone who's just spoken on this. I mean, the only person on the platform who ought to be defending it kind of can't. So how bad can it possibly be? It's going to be a disaster for London, and London's mayor, everyone standing for mayor, needs to be shouting very, very loud about this. I got told off by my press officer for saying it would decimate council housing, because he thought I was misusing the word decimate. But in Camden, we have worked out that with the forced sell-off of high-value homes, and the kind of turnover that we have of family homes, which isn't very high, but we worked out that 10% of our, more than 10% of our council homes would be lost during the process, because so many of our council homes are above the threshold for the forced sell-off. And we're not going to get these things back. We have to be preserving them. And right to buy for housing associations, when that was first announced, it sounded like a joke, because the government doesn't own these places anyway. How could it possibly do that? And it turns out that the forced sell-off of council housing is going to help pay for that. I mean, it's the worst bill ever. It really does need to fall. I hope there is now a momentum building to help it to do that, that the Lords might do enough to hold it up, and that the government might, as it has done with a number of things recently, lose faith in itself and actually just drop it for the future. But we have a lot of campaigning to do, and I'm really pleased that Labour are campaigning really hard on this. But we shouldn't in London forget that it's also Labour councils who are doing a lot of the regeneration projects that are in fact demolishing a lot of our council estates. Now, I know that's not ideological, but they are doing a terrible, terrible job of regeneration across London. Zach Goldsmith basically has a dislike for council estates, and he's expressed that. And the Tories want to destroy them, but Labour are demolishing them. We are not getting back the homes that they demolish. Darren Johnson from the London Assembly has calculated that we're losing 7,000 council homes in some of these regeneration plans that have already got permission, and I think that is really, really wrong.
Just Joy wants to very quickly have a head back on that.
Just to clarify, you know, Zach doesn't have some kind of, I don't know what the term was that you used, hatred for
That was not my term.
Okay. Because he actually wants to create the London-wide housing fund to help councils work together to pool skills, funding, and resources in order to deliver more social housing for the most vulnerable residents in London. He is tackling this problem. It's mentioned in his manifesto. He does want to create more social housing. He sees this as a problem within London that he wants to tackle. He is also going to tackle properties for private rented homes for people who are on low and middle incomes. He is looking at this and wants to develop problems and protect the most vulnerable in London. So I do take offense to that because there's nothing in his manifesto that would say that. I've never seen him even remotely entertain such ideas because he is someone who will stand up for the most vulnerable in London.
Right, well, one question here from Samir, who's at home. How do you plan...
You said I could come in. I've been given the mic. I asked the question...
well, that's a surprise. This is fantastic. What have you got to say?
It's great to have the mic. I'm from Islington, Kilda Housing Bill, and I was quite pleased to hear that our Tory friend there had nothing to say about the housing bill, and that everybody else spoke against it. I'm particularly pleased about what Tom said, but what I'd like to see is Sadiq saying the same sort of thing. It is a vote winner. It has been. It is a vote winner, and it will also, if he makes a big issue of this, it will also mean that it will be much more difficult to get that bill through, and it will make a real political crisis for the Tories. So tell him, please, to say a lot more on this. It's horrific.
So I'll just very quickly let Tom have a comeback now.
He has been talking about it. In fact, he did put down an amendment to the bill to try and improve it slightly. And his amendment would have ensured that before any home was sold, it had to already have been replaced. Now, every party, I think the Liberal Democrats voted for it, Caroline Lucas voted for it. The only party that voted against it was the Conservative Party. And that would have at least ensured that there would have been a guaranteed replacement before a home was lost. So he has been very active on this cause. But I'm always happy to go back to him and to say, talk louder about it.
He does like abstaining, though. He does like abstaining. So in the Snoopers Charters bill and the welfare bill, Labour have got a habit at the moment of abstaining. And Sadiq Khan can't do enough to distance himself from Jeremy Corbyn at the moment. So I'll keep a close eye on Sadiq Khan.
Sadiq's his own man. Without bringing the welfare bill and the Snoopers Charter in tonight, I think. And just one question here. How can you, if you are elected mayor or your candidate is elected mayor, end the postcode lottery of council enforcement against bad landlords or letting agents, given so much of it seems to depend on whether or not your local council actually cares? So we'll just try and get through this one nice and quickly. David?
We obviously, the mayor has a lot of power in the centre to look at what the councils are doing, and we lobby for that, and be an authority above the local councils to make sure it happens.
Joy?
I mean, like I said, there is good things coming in to tackle rogue landlords that people now can complain to their councils. Zach wants to make the London rental standard mandatory, so you would have to register as a landlord. We can keep track of who is on the blacklist. We can advertise that. It's a way to give more transparency into the private rented sector, which is something we desperately need. There obviously is an issue of rogue landlords. It's a big issue in Ealing. The problem is that most councils don't have the administrative capacity to tackle it within their licensing enforcement team. We've even looked at it in Ealing. We just don't have the ability. It would require a massive amount of funding coming from City Hall. I mean, millions and millions and millions to say that it could be a scheme that people could easily avoid. So it is something, obviously, we need to tackle, and Zach is going to do that by making the London the London rental standard mandatory. But, you know, it is something that we need to really look at.
A third of London boroughs didn't prosecute a single landlord. Somewhere like Newham that has a mandatory register or a voluntary register that's moving towards mandatory is something that we need to have. Stephen Knight, Liberal Democrat Assembly member, just produced a report on tackling rogue landlords. It looks at ending retaliation evictions, ending revenge evictions, and really making sure that landlords are on a register. So when you're buying or renting a house from them, you know exactly who you're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely do need a register. There isn't the power to make the licensing mandatory at the moment. You can license landlords. You need to have a very good justification for it. You generally can't do your whole borough. There's a couple of boroughs that have managed to argue that they can at the moment. But what we can do, and what we do quite well in London, is open up the data. And again, this is where I think the Renters' Union could be a really good sort of place to put the central data. We can help link together the databases that there currently are. We can open up the data standard. We can let the Renters' Union then publish that, get people registering their own landlords onto the register, and then logging the problems. And again, we are not seeing enforcement in the councils. I'm a councillor in Camden. I've been chasing them up for not enforcing very many. They were one of the lowest in terms of taking landlords to court and issuing notices. They do very little, apart from when it's a Tory councillor who's a rogue landlord, and then they actually go and prosecute, which was quite interesting. It's a Labour council in Camden, so there may have been a political motive to that one. But yeah, I think we need to be putting together a blacklist at a London level. We need to be organising tenants together, renters together, to put the landlords on a register and log the problems, so that we can see if the lack of enforcement is because of lack of complaints or because of just rubbish amounts of work being done by the councils. And then we can put pressure on and actually scrutinise them properly. While we lack the power to force all landlords onto a register, I think that's a really good thing we can be doing.
Tom? There are two boroughs in London at the moment that have borough-wide licensing, and that's Newham and Croydon. And Newham was the first, and Croydon just managed to get theirs through before the government changed the rules, so that if a borough wants to license more than 20% of its area, it has to be approved by the Secretary of State. Again, it's called localism. Redbridge recently, which is a Labour-run borough, applied to the Secretary of State after a full consultation with residents that was in favour of landlord licensing, and the Secretary of State said, you know what, no, can't have it. So I would like to see, Sadiq has been clear that he is going to support boroughs that want to have licensing. I would like to see the mayor, and there's some truth in what Sian says about the lack of enforcement, and let's bear in mind that the local government has borne the brunt of the cuts that are being handed down from central government. Local government has very few resources to play with. I would like to see whoever the next mayor is doing a lot more to coordinate between the boroughs and try and get some sort of action and support for boroughs so that they can prosecute landlords. One of the problems is that where boroughs do prosecute, they don't get to keep any of the fines. That all goes to the Treasury. And they often have to pay their own costs as well. So I also think the mayor needs to be pushing the government to change the law to allow boroughs to keep the fines that they get from prosecuting landlords. What a wonderful incentive that would be to take action.
Amazing. Well, look, ladies and gentlemen, you've been very, very patient with us tonight. We've had a lot of debate. What I'm going to do quickly is go along and do a few quick-fire questions to the panel. We're going to go from that end all the way along, and we're going to be no waffle, no talking too much about what your particular policy you can just about remember from your manifesto is. We're going to go very quickly from the start. So, is the rent in London too damn high?
It's far too high.
Joy?
Yes.
Oh, God, yes.
On average, 53% of your average salary.
Tom?
Absolutely, it's far too high.
Have you ever been a landlord?
No.
No.
Good. Well, we've got that. Just thought we'd see if we can catch any of them out.
So far.
How much should an affordable rent be for a two-bed flat in Zone 2 in London?
£800 a month.
I want what you're getting. Joy,
I think it should be protected based on how much you earn, so I think there should be varying rent levels. So if you're a social tenant, you should pay less. If you're working on an income, a lower income, you should pay less. It should be, you should have levels of rent that reflect either what you're earning or if you're a social tenant, so that it's fair and you do have genuinely mixed communities.
Zach, what do you think of fair rent for a two-bed flat in central London?
I agree with this. I'm not sure Joy's a Tory.
No, that's in Zach's manifesto. I'm not making that up. That's straight from Zach's manifesto.
Sean.
We need to look at this and really work this out. But I think you are talking about 30% of your salary at most.
Yeah, affordable rent is defined as you shouldn't pay more than a third of your net salary a month in rent. So that's generally regarded as what is affordable.
Where would you move to in London if you had absolute free rein to go anywhere you could? Where would you take a flat?
Romford.
Romford? Unexpected.
Joy?
Well, I have a 4-year-old, so wherever there's a good school, close.
Camden Town, if there's anyone in here from Camden, please vote for me. I had to.
I'm loyal to where I live and represent, so Kentish Town.
We've got 3 of us from Camden here. I live in Kentish Town. Tomorrow I'm moving down to Somers Town, so closer to Zach. So I just want to live in the borough of Camden.
And just very quickly, I want each of you to tell us your one London housing horror story. What is the worst?
Personally, or?
Personally, yes. What's the worst? And we can start. Go on.
Okay, so
So I think we'll give people half a second.
I've got
Sean's
one.
got one to start.
So the Evening Standard were coming round my house, and my toilet had been broken for about 6 months, and I'd been flushing it with a bucket. And I got it mended 3 days before they came. I was really pleased with myself. And on the morning they were about to arrive, it broke again. So I had to hand the Evening Standard a bucket to flush the toilet, which was in the paper. So that was my horror story.
Well, David, you'll be hard pressed to beat that one, but have a go.
I moved into a lovely flat in Peckham, which I was just had for a very short time, for just a couple of months, and it was all wonderful. I was so happy. And then on the second night, I heard this little scratching sound above my cupboard, and there's a little rat. And I couldn't catch it, and I just ended up living with this rat for a couple of months. Whatever I did,
Did you give it a name?
I didn't love it too much, I'm afraid. Whatever I did, I couldn't get rid of this rat.
Joy?
Oh, I had a similar incident, except I screamed. People thought someone was getting murdered in our flat. Couldn't get the rats out. We ended up with a cat the next day. My husband was terrified. We still have the cat 3 years later. Got rid of the mice, but that's what happens, so.
Yeah.
I live in a house with 16 other people, so it's quite big shared space
Sorry,
at the moment.
16.
16 people. So a lot of my stories revolve around the characters that move in, because we have new people every couple of weeks. There's constant turnover. But our shower's been broken for 2 months, so my my horror story is happening right now, if I'm honest. I'm having to go to the local gym constantly to shower. Also, just as an interesting bit of trivia, me and Tom used to live in the same building, so I'm hoping that his horror story wasn't living with me.
And Tom, exactly how awful was it to live with Zach?
All the noise and Zach used to live literally directly in the flat underneath mine, so he used to have my big Vote Labour sign up there, and then his Vote Liberal Democrat diamond.
Quite big.
Mine actually, I mean, the point Zach makes about having to live essentially with strangers a lot of the time is sort of my one really as well. I mean, for most of the time I've managed to live with good, decent people, but there was one time when I did live with a flatmate who was just so awful that at one point I almost felt like it was starting to affect my mental health. And of course you can't get out. You're often you are locked in. It's not that you're necessarily locked in, but you've really got nowhere else to go. And because more and more people are forced to share with more and more people they don't know for longer periods of time, I think it can have a big impact on people's mental health and well-being if they are living with people who they do not get on with.
Well, there's a thought to finish on. Can I just say, on behalf of Generation Rent, Renters' Rights London and PricedOut, who've organised this evening, there's a lot of people around here who puts a lot of time into getting this on the road. Thank you very much to them. Thank you very much to all the people who've come along and sat on the panel, and most of all, thanks very much to all of you for coming along. Thank you.